choices. Now, I'm going to be talking about the era in which Trudeau was Prime Minister, and I don't attribute all of the good things to Trudeau himself. In many ways, he kind of was reluctantly dragged along. There was a real upsurge in support for Canadian sovereignty and a real disgust with what the United States was doing in Vietnam and other things. And there were movements, especially in English-speaking Canada, for economic nationalism. The Waffle Movement for an Independent Socialist Canada was started in 1969. And in many ways, in a reaction to that, the more centrist people who were worried that the socialists were taking over the economic nationalist kind of position formed the Committee for an Independent Canada, which is really the forerunner of the Council of Canadians. And Mel Herdig was involved in the founding of both of those. These movements had actually quite a bit of effect on policy. I'll say something about my brother for a minute. In 1968, when he was 27, he wrote a book called The Energy Poker Game, in which he called for the creation of a publicly owned, government-owned oil company. He was the first person to do that. Tommy Douglas, who was the federal leader of the NDP at that point, really liked the idea, and he started to promote it. And when the NDP was in 1972 to 74, supported the Trudeau minority government, the NDP demanded that the Liberals, as a condition for support, set up a publicly owned oil company. And both the Waffle and the Committee for Independent Canada were very much pushing that kind of thing. Okay. So Trudeau was in power from 1968 to 84 with a very short 9-month interlude for Joe Clark's government in 79-80. And it coincided with the presidencies of Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan's first term. Now, the policies which came out at that time were as bold as those of Carter, overlapping that same period, much more around Canadian energy independence. But it also coincided with doing good environmental things, cutting back on consumption, largely by Canada riding the American coattail rather than doing its own policy. Of course, Canada didn't have its own Canadian-owned auto industry, so Canadians were buying more efficient American cars because of the U.S. policy. But certainly, independence in those days coincided with Canada going greener. When Trudeau took office in 1968, Canada was a U.S. energy satellite, as it is again today. The Canadian industry started in 1858, soon became a northern extension of the American one. By 1970, foreign-owned owners controlled 91% of the assets of petroleum companies in Canada. 4/5 of the foreign ownership was American. Rather than supply all of Canadian consumers, Canada exported half its production to the U.S. and imported half from offshore to eastern Canada. There was no talk then, in 1970, of energy security for Canadians, and like today, the federal government had no plans for it. Ensuring security of supply of natural gas is not a great problem, except in Atlantic Canada. We had an all-Canadian pipeline that went to an all-Canadian route to Quebec City. So other than the 4 Atlantic provinces, we had natural gas security for Canadians. Oil was the main energy security issue, as Canadians were about to learn in the Arab oil boycott of 1973-74. There was an oil pipeline went from Western Canada to Ontario, but it went through Wisconsin and Michigan, and it dropped off about 2/3 of its oil en route before it got to Ontario. No oil pipeline reached Quebec, which along with Atlantic Canada depended entirely on offshore oil. Well, with the Canada quickly discarded its energy satellite status under the twin pressures of international oil crisis of the 1970s and this rise in sentiment for popular Canadian sovereignty. Canada joined the resource nationalism that was coursing around the world at the same time and set up Petro-Canada, which bought out one transnational oil company after another. This coincided when we did this exactly with, we were in tune with the resource nationalism that was going around in the world at that time. In the first half of the 1970s, there were 336 major takeovers of transnational corporations, or if you want to call it, deglobalizations of corporations that happened around the world. In 1980, people think that globalization can only go one way. The National Energy Program set a goal of raising Canadian ownership to 50% within 10 years, a lot of it through government ownership as well as private. It was wildly popular, the Canadian ownership angle of it. The Made in Canada policy came before the NEP, and the idea was to bring Western oil to Montreal. For the first time, in order to divert oil to Quebec, Canada had to cut exports to the United States, and it told the U.S. that it would send them oil only if there were long-term surpluses to Canada's needs. When the international price of oil skyrocketed, rising 10 to 12-fold from 1973 to 79, Canada held down the domestic price, but charged the U.S. the world price for Canadian exports. By 1981, Canadian oil exports had dwindled to 14% of their 1973 level. And we had cut imports by 72%. But this Canada First policy did not last long. Timing was unfortunate. World oil prices crashed in 1982. Although all oil-producing regions in the world suffered devastating crashes after boom times, most Albertans blamed the NEP for Alberta's economic crash. Mexico defaulted on its debt. My brother-in-law, who was a diver in Louisiana off the Gulf Coast, lost his job. Texas and Louisiana, everywhere, was equally devastated to Alberta. When I was in Alberta at that time, and I used to say, I know that the federal government is really powerful, the National Energy Program, but do you think they actually caused that crisis in Mexico and all the oil export? I didn't realize that Kuwait, they were that powerful to cause this devastation all around the world. I wasn't very popular when I did this. So they were helped along, Albertans were helped along in this this view by the hysterical corporate media and Alberta government. The stage was set to overturn the National Energy Program and insert the proportionality clause to ensure it would never rise again in the FTA. So the old NEP was replaced by a new NEP, no energy policy, and that still reigns today. Currently, Canada greatly oversteps its carbon footprint. With 0.5% of the world's people, Canada produces 3.8% of the world's oil and consumes 2.7% of it. But there are signs of hope, and I'm going to be in a few minutes outlining the Barack Obama thing.